Hi there, and welcome to Mike and Peter, Mike Kasten and Peter Abrahamson. We are the lawyer and the therapist. I'm the therapist, Mike is the lawyer, and we are talking about issues relating to mental health in the legal profession. And we talk about something that has been on our mind for a while, or something new that has come up. And something new that has come up and which confuses me no end, I have to admit, is something called quiet quitting. Now, when I hear the word quiet quitting, I think of me back in the day when I was so annoyed with the way I was being treated, ignored, not taken seriously, all the rest of it, that I gave up complaining. I went quiet, and then it wasn't long before I resigned. To me, that was quiet quitting. But then you look up what it means, and today, quiet quitting means working to rule or working to contract. So I'm confused because quiet quitting actually just means working. So why would that be a problem? I've read a couple of articles, and I'm sure you have as well, Mike. So we need to figure out, how does this affect, if at all, the legal profession?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's one of those terms that one of those phrases that all of a sudden you hear everywhere, right? It sort of enters the cultural zeitgeist. And these little phrases, they're really important because I think they frame things in a particular way. And yeah, you've read some articles. I think the best thing that I've seen on this is actually a comedian that I follow on TikTok. He's also on Twitter, but his name is Scott Seiss. And he has a little 60-second thing on quiet quitting where he says, when an employee only does what's required, it's called quiet quitting. And he says, no, it's called doing your job. And it's very funny. I recommend checking him out. But that's actually really how I feel about this. I feel like this is kind of coming from like the employer side of things and the sort of corporate side of things. And I think in a lot of ways it's unfair because I think it comes back to one of the topics we've talked about before here in the legal field, but also, of course, in other fields, and that's culture. Because I think when people feel dissatisfied with their jobs, they're not going to go above and beyond. And I don't think we should really expect them to. I think the expectation should really be on management and leadership to make it such that the job is interesting and fulfilling and encourages people to, be creative and be fulfilled. And I think if that's happening, you're not going to have this phenomenon. You're going to have people sort of being their best and doing their best. So I think it really kind of turns it around in kind of an unfair way. Yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned that phrase, working to rule, because that's another phrase I've heard. And it sort of frames this in like a sort of labor dispute, right? Whose phraseology are we taking? Kind of the employee's phraseology of like, wow, this culture sucks and is toxic, and I don't want to be here. Or do you take kind of the employer's phraseology of the same phenomenon and calling it quiet quitting and kind of putting the blame in the other place?
Two extremely good points, because when I saw this working to rule, I immediately went back in my mind to the 1970s labor disputes in Denmark, where the unions would encourage their members to work to rule, and then in that way show that nothing would happen if you only did what you had to do. But I also agree with you that it is a management problem, isn't it? I usually have a lot of time for the research that Gallup Institute does, because they have loads of resources. They do some really quality research into the workplace and all sorts of issues there. But some of the stuff that come out from them says that 50% of American workers are quiet quitting. Now, that makes me think, okay, so does that mean that half the American working population is about to resign? No, that is not it. So it must mean that half the working population actually works. Great. Isn't that what you want? So I think we have to look at who have we got in the organization instead of just hammering one level or the other. Because there are those who want to go to work and have a job. That's what they want, and then they go home again. And then there are those who go to work because they want a career. And there's a difference between wanting to rise up the hierarchy if you're in an organization that has that, and to just going to work, do your stuff, and go home again. So but we need both. We can't expect everybody to just go above and beyond. But then there is the element that I faced once, that in retaliation to poor management and poor treatment, I decided to look at my contract, which says this is what you have to do, or my work description. And then, and I keep going on here, but there's another problem creeping in, because I have never had an employment contract or a job description which didn't have in it somewhere or such activities as deemed reasonable or necessary by the company, something along those lines. So what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, you know, I keep thinking as you're speaking, that what we're really doing here, that it is sort of a management problem. And so when you look at the statistics and say 50% of people are quiet quitting, you know, what does that really, you know, aren't you sort of telling on yourself a little bit as management? Doesn't that mean that instead of feeling like they're, you know, being their best selves and being creative and going above and beyond, people are not happy with the culture, not happy with the workplace, and whose sort of fault is that? And this is another one of those issues that I think my perspective on it has changed as I've gotten a little bit older. But to me, it sort of feels like you're blaming the victim a little bit. And I think the parallel that I see in the mental health space is, you know, it's like, well, you know, if you're struggling with your mental health, you should learn, you know, you should do mindfulness, and you should do yoga, and you should go for a run, and you should use this app. And all those things are great, but really, like, let's look at the root of the problem, which is a lot of the root is like, you know, the stress is unsustainable. I'm not feeling like I have a sense of belonging. I don't, you know, I'm sort of eating or burying, you know, my feelings. And so I think a lot of it comes down to kind of work culture. And, you know, if you're doing work that you feel matters, and if you feel like you matter, and if you have strong relationships and you have a good sense of belonging, I think that's going to align in such a way that your work's not going to feel so much like work. And I think in that situation, you know, I think employers will be really happy, and they'll say, oh, this person is great. That person goes above and beyond. But that only happens if you foster a certain environment and culture and give that person, you know, what they need to feel, you know, like good about themselves mentally. And I think when you don't do that, it's not the employee's fault. It's kind of your fault.
So are we in a sense talking about greed, having now seen the implications of that happening? Because if employers are really calculating that we can get by with fewer employees if we ask those that we do have to run faster and to work harder, then that's good for the bottom line. Now, I'm sure that happens in some places. I don't know what that's like in the legal profession, because no one owns up to that being the case. But I have heard a lot about lean teams, where the teams have become so lean, so small, that actually the workload has become ridiculous for those who are on those teams. But also, yeah, are we blaming the victim here?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I think it's a misnomer. I don't know that actually it is an issue that is bigger now than it always was.
I agree.
But the whole debate, like so many other debates at this point in time, seems to be very polarized, that we are opposing parties, employers against employees, or employees against employers. And you can see the narrative in so many posts on LinkedIn, for example, that something is being hammered to death by the other side, like the college versus trade, for example. That's a big thing that's going on. Where can't we just choose what we want?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think, you know, and you mentioned, I think, a very good point, you know, going back to the 70s, or, you know, way earlier in the 20th century, you know, disputes between sort of, you know, labor on the one side and sort of management on the other side, are nothing new. And I think this phrase, quiet quitting, is kind of part of the framing, the war of words, you know, in that labor dispute. But, you know, I think it's a fair point. Like, are things really much different? And I think, you know, one difference might be, you know, that things are shifting in the work world a little bit for law firms and others where, people don't necessarily want to come in the office. People say, hey, I'm enjoying this hybrid work. I can be effective. And I think, employers are it's a struggle, right? There are good reasons, I think, to try and get people in the office for mentorship and for great culture and for teamwork. But when I think they're faced with employees not wanting to do that, I think part of the response to that is to say, well, you don't really care about your career. You just want to stay at home. And then I think the next step from that is sort of quiet quitting or not going above and beyond, right? If you loved me, you would come to the office, right? But on the flip side, it's like, we'll make a place that you want to come to and make it valuable. I think when it is valuable, people do come. Like I go in twice a week now because it's valuable for me to, not because they're serving better coffee and free lunches, which are things that we're doing, but more, to see people, there's some value, but there's also value for me in, not commuting 3 hours a day and taking those 3 hours back in my life. So I think this is sort of part of that struggle and that change in the world.
I'm just thinking we're talking about the legal profession here because that's where you come from, and those are the people I work with. A law firm has more in it than just lawyers. You've got all the support staff, you've got the secretaries, the executive assistants, you've got the IT, finance, HR, depending on the size and shape of the firm. Does quiet quitting apply to lawyers? Does quiet quitting apply to the support staff around them? What do you think?
I think it's being applied to sort of everybody. I think maybe the original focus is on lawyers, but I think it's the same struggle, which includes paralegals and support staff, and I think it's the same issue, which is if you're at a job, like you want to feel like you're impacting the world and like it's good for you in terms of relationships and like there's a benefit to you, not just financial. And I think in those situations, no matter what role you play in the law firm, you're going to kind of be your best self. And I think when you're dissatisfied because you're not getting those things, you're maybe just going to do the bare minimum and say, well, I don't really want to come into work. So, I'll just work these 5 hours. And so I think it applies, I think it's the same issues can apply whether you're attorney or non-attorney. So
the trick is really to avoid the extremes, avoid exploitation by employer and avoid taking the mickey by employee. So meet somewhere in the middle and agree what do we expect of one another. And
I think so.
Then sort it out in that way instead of having those trench wars.
Yeah, I think it's always better to sort of ask why, and to sort of sometimes look inward at the reason for that and adjust, than just to sort of start a fight and call names, right? So I think, if you get an employee that maybe that you feel isn't putting in that effort and doesn't want to return, the question might be, well, why is that?
Yeah,
if you can address that, I think that's better for both sides than just saying, oh, you're a bad person because you're quiet quitting. I don't think that really helps either side. So what the conclusion is I take from this is have the dialogue going, treat each other as adults and human beings instead of just throwing terminology and names at each other. I think so. It always does come back to that, doesn't it? The being human part that we forget so often. It does. I think we should leave it there. People have had the break in their coffee. I'm getting further down into mine for sure. And thank you everybody for watching, and we shall see you shortly in another video. Take care.